Sarah Martinez walked through the hallways of Lincoln High School with her head held high, despite the whispers and snickers that followed her every step. Her military camouflage jacket, perfectly pressed and adorned with various patches, stood out like a beacon among the designer clothes and trendy outfits of her classmates. At 17, she carried herself with a discipline that most teenagers her age couldn't comprehend, her posture straight and her movements purposeful. The jacket wasn't just a fashion statement or an attempt to look tough. It was her father's, Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED explosion changed their family's life forever. The jacket still carried his scent, a mixture of aftershave and something uniquely him that Sarah couldn't quite describe but never wanted to forget. She wore it every day, not just to school but everywhere she went, as if keeping a piece of him close could somehow bring him back. "Look at little soldier girl," Jessica Palmer sneered as Sarah passed by her locker, surrounded by her usual group of followers. Jessica was everything Sarah wasn't: popular, wealthy, and completely disconnected from the real world beyond their small suburban town. Does she think she's going to war or something? This isn't Call of Duty, freak. The laughter that erupted from the group cut through Sarah like a knife, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Her mother, Elena, had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people you were fighting didn't understand what real battles looked like. Still, each cruel comment added another weight to her already heavy heart. Sarah's day followed its usual pattern. In first period history, Mr. Thompson was discussing World War II, and, when he mentioned the sacrifices of American soldiers, several students turned to look at her with mocking smiles. During lunch, she sat alone at a corner table, reading letters from military pen pals she had connected with through an online support group for military families. The cafeteria buzzed with typical teenage drama: who was dating whom, weekend party plans, complaints about homework, while Sarah immersed herself in stories from soldiers stationed around the world who understood her pain. The afternoon brought PE class, which was always the worst part of her day. Coach Williams had divided the class into teams for flag football, and, as expected, Sarah was picked last. Not because she lacked athletic ability, quite the opposite, actually. Her daily morning runs and the fitness routine she had adopted to honor her father's memory had made her stronger and faster than most of her classmates. But being good at sports didn't matter when no one wanted the weird military girl on their team. "Great, we got the Army reject," muttered Kevin Brooks, the team captain who had been forced to take her. Kevin was the quarterback of the varsity football team, popular and arrogant, with a father who owned the biggest car dealership in town. To him, Sarah was just an oddity to be tolerated, not understood. As they lined up for the first play, Sarah noticed the way her teammates positioned themselves as far from her as possible. When Coach Williams blew the whistle, she ran her route perfectly, getting open in the end zone, but Kevin deliberately threw the ball to a covered receiver instead. The pass was intercepted, and he immediately pointed at Sarah as if it were her fault. "Maybe if you weren't wearing that ridiculous jacket all the time, people might actually want to throw to you," Kevin said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What are you trying to prove anyway? Your dad's not coming back just because you dress like him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The entire class went silent, sensing they had crossed a line even by their usual standards. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, the emotions she kept buried threatening to surface. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and, for a moment, she considered saying something back, defending herself, explaining why the jacket meant everything to her. Instead, she turned and walked toward the school building, ignoring Coach Williams calling after her. She needed space to breathe, to collect herself before she broke down completely in front of everyone. The last thing she wanted was to give them more ammunition to use against her. Sarah found refuge in the library, a quiet sanctuary where Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, had always been kind to her. She settled into a corner behind the biography section, surrounded by stories of people who had overcome incredible odds, and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her father's old text messages, reading them for the 100th time, finding comfort in his words of encouragement and love. Mija, one message read, sent just 2 weeks before his final deployment: "Remember that being strong isn't about what others see on the outside. It's about having the courage to keep going when everything inside you wants to give up. You have that strength. I see it every day." Tears blurred her vision as she read those words again. Miguel Martinez had been more than just her father, he had been her hero, her role model, her best friend. When other dads were teaching their daughters about makeup and dating, Miguel was teaching Sarah about honor, duty, and service to something greater than yourself. He had planned to retire from the army when his enlistment was up, to be home for her senior year and to walk her down the aisle at her wedding someday. The IED that killed him had stolen all of those dreams in an instant. Sarah's mother, Elena, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat financially, a morning shift at the local hospital as a nurse's aide and evenings cleaning office buildings downtown. She left for work before Sarah woke up and often didn't return until after midnight. Elena dealt with her grief by staying busy, by filling every moment with work so she didn't have time to think about the empty chair at their dinner table or the side of the bed that would always be cold. This left Sarah alone most of the time, which suited her fine. She had grown tired of well-meaning neighbors and distant relatives telling her that her father was a hero, that she should be proud, that time would heal her wounds. Pride didn't bring him back, and time only seemed to make the ache more permanent. The military benefits helped with the bills, but they couldn't fill the hole in their family. At home that evening, Sarah sat at her desk working on an essay for English class about personal heroes. While other students wrote about celebrities, athletes, or historical figures they had read about in textbooks, Sarah wrote about her father. She described the way he had taught her to change a tire when she was 12, insisting that she needed to be self-sufficient. She wrote about the Saturday mornings they spent volunteering at the local veterans hospital, where he would talk with older veterans about their service while she played board games with patients who had no family visitors. She remembered the night before his final deployment when he had sat on her bed and given her the camouflage jacket. "This is my lucky jacket," he had said, smoothing down the patches that told the story of his military career. "I wore it through basic training, through my first deployment, through some of the hardest times in my life. I want you to have it while I'm gone, to remind you that I'm always with you, no matter how far away I am." Sarah had protested, saying he should keep it for luck, but Miguel had smiled and shook his head. "You're my luck, Mija. You and your mother are the reason I fight, the reason I come home. This jacket will keep you safe while I'm keeping other people safe." 6 months later, she wore that same jacket to his funeral. The next morning brought more of the same treatment at school. Sarah had hoped that maybe Kevin's cruel comment from the day before might have made some people think twice about their behavior, but, if anything, it seemed to have emboldened them. In the hallway before first period, someone had taped a printed sign to her locker that read "PTSD Princess" with a crude drawing of a crying girl in military uniform. Sarah removed the sign carefully, folding it up and putting it in her backpack with the others she had collected over the past months. She kept them all, not as reminders of her torment, but as evidence of how cruel people could be when they didn't understand pain that wasn't their own. Someday, she thought, maybe she would show them to a counselor or principal, but, for now, she carried the burden alone. During second period chemistry, Sarah was paired with Marcus Chen for a lab experiment. Marcus was one of the few students who didn't actively participate in the mockery, though he didn't defend her either. He was quiet, studious, and seemed to understand what it meant to be an outsider. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was young, and, while he had been born in America, some students still treated him as if he didn't belong. "I'm sorry about what Kevin said yesterday," Marcus said quietly as they measured chemicals for their experiment. "That was really messed up." Sarah looked up from her notebook, surprised by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said simply, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. "My grandfather served in the military," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper so their classmates couldn't hear. "In Taiwan, before my family came here. He used to tell me that wearing a uniform was about carrying the honor of everyone who wore it before you. I think what you're doing is brave." For the first time in months, Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe not everyone at Lincoln High was completely heartless. Maybe there were others who understood, even if they didn't speak up. The thought carried her through the rest of the day, making the stares and whispers slightly more bearable. That afternoon, as Sarah walked across the school parking lot toward the city bus stop, she heard the familiar sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air. She looked up automatically, as she always did when she heard that sound, watching as a military helicopter passed overhead. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that it was her father coming home, that this was all just a terrible nightmare she was about to wake up from. The helicopter disappeared beyond the trees, leaving only the ordinary sounds of suburban life, car engines, students calling to each other, the distant whistle of the football coach conducting after-school practice. Sarah adjusted her father's jacket and continued walking, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. At home that evening, Elena was actually there for dinner, a rare occurrence that usually meant she had taken time off for a parent-teacher conference or a medical appointment. They ate quietly, the television news playing in the background, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Elena looked tired, more tired than usual, with dark circles under her eyes and a persistent cough that she claimed was just allergies. "How was school today, Mija?" Elena asked, attempting to inject some normalcy into their fractured routine. "Fine," Sarah answered automatically, the same response she had given every day for the past 8 months. She had stopped telling her mother about the bullying months ago, knowing that Elena had enough to worry about without adding teenage drama to her burdens. "I got a call from Mrs. Henderson at the school library today," Elena said, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "She said you've been spending a lot of time there, that you seem to be struggling." Sarah looked up from her plate, surprised that the librarian had reached out. "I just like to read there. It's quiet." "Sarah, I know I haven't been around much lately. I know I've been working too much and leaving you alone too often. But I need you to know that you can talk to me. About anything. About your father, about school, about whatever is making you sad." For a moment, Sarah considered telling her mother everything, about the daily humiliation, about the loneliness, about how wearing their father's jacket was the only thing that made her feel connected to him anymore. But, looking at Elena's exhausted face, seeing the worry lines that hadn't been there before Miguel's death, Sarah couldn't add to her mother's pain. "I'm okay, Mom," she said instead. "Really? I just miss him." Elena nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I miss him too, Mija. Every single day." They finished dinner in silence, both women wrapped in their private grief, neither knowing how to bridge the gap that loss had created between them. Outside, the sun was setting, and, somewhere across the country, military families were sitting down to dinner together, sharing stories of their day, planning for their future. Sarah went to bed that night wearing her father's jacket over her pajamas, as she had every night since the funeral. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about Marcus's words, about his grandfather's service, about the idea that wearing a uniform meant carrying forward the honor of those who had worn it before. Maybe her classmates would never understand, but that didn't make it less true. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and mockery, another day of eating lunch alone and being picked last in PE class. But tonight, wrapped in her father's jacket, Sarah felt the strength he had always said she possessed. She was Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez's daughter, and that meant something, even if no one else could see it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of the same routine. Sarah woke up each morning, put on her father's jacket, and faced another day of isolation at Lincoln High School. The mockery had become so commonplace that she barely registered it anymore. It was like background noise, always there but no longer sharp enough to cut through her emotional armor. She had learned to exist in her own bubble, moving through the halls like a ghost, present but not really participating in the life around her. What she didn't know was that her story was about to intersect with forces much larger than the petty cruelty of high school bullies. 3,000 miles away, at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Colonel James Mitchell was reading through a stack of letters that had been forwarded to his office by the Army's Family Readiness Group. These were letters from military families across the country, sharing their struggles, their triumphs, and their ongoing battles with grief and adjustment. One letter stood out among the dozens he received each week. It was from Elena Martinez, Sarah's mother, written during one of her sleepless nights when the weight of single parenthood and grief had become too much to bear alone. Elena had written to the Military Support Network, not asking for help but simply sharing her story, describing how her daughter had become a target for bullying because of her pride in her father's service. Colonel Mitchell had served alongside Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez during his second deployment in Afghanistan. They had been in different units but had crossed paths during several joint operations. He remembered Miguel as a dedicated soldier and a devoted family man who carried pictures of his wife and daughter everywhere he went. When Miguel spoke about Sarah, his face would light up with pride as he described her intelligence, her determination, and her fierce loyalty to family. Reading Elena's letter brought back memories of conversations he had with Miguel during long nights at remote outposts. Miguel had worried about how his multiple deployments were affecting Sarah, about missing important moments in her teenage years, about whether she understood why his service mattered. He had spoken often about wanting to show Sarah the honor that came with military service, to help her understand that the sacrifices their family made were part of something bigger than themselves. Colonel Mitchell made a decision that would change Sarah's life forever. He reached out to his network of contacts, including Major Lisa Rodriguez, who served as a liaison between active military units and civilian communities for morale and educational visits. Together, they began planning something that had never been attempted at a civilian high school before. Meanwhile, Sarah's daily existence continued unchanged. The autumn weather was turning cooler, which gave her an excuse to keep her father's jacket zipped up, hiding some of the patches that drew the most attention from her classmates. She had started taking different routes through the school to avoid the main hallways where Jessica Palmer and her friends congregated, though this often meant being late to class and earning disapproving looks from teachers. In her U.S. government class, Mr. Peterson was leading a discussion about military service and civic duty. Sarah sat in the back corner, as always, listening as her classmates shared their largely uninformed opinions about war, soldiers, and patriotism. Most of them had never known anyone in the military personally, and their understanding came primarily from movies and video games. "I don't understand why anyone would want to join the military," said Ashley Morgan, a cheerleader whose biggest concern in life was whether her nail polish matched her outfit. "Like, why would you want to go somewhere dangerous for basically minimum wage? It seems really dumb." Several students nodded in agreement, and Sarah felt her jaw clench. These were the same people who enjoyed the freedoms that her father had died protecting, and they couldn't even conceive of service as something noble or necessary. "What do you think, Sarah?" Mr. Peterson asked, noticing her tense posture. "You've been pretty quiet during our discussions about military service." All eyes turned toward her, and Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment and anger rising in her chest. She could feel Jessica smirking at her from across the room, waiting for her to either stay silent or say something that could be used against her later. "I think," Sarah said carefully, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "that most people don't understand what military service really means. They think it's just about fighting wars, but it's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything for strangers who will never know your name." The classroom fell silent. Even Jessica had stopped smirking, perhaps sensing something different in Sarah's tone. "My father served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "He didn't do it for money or glory. He did it because he believed that freedom wasn't free, and that someone had to be willing to pay the price for it. He died protecting people he had never met, in a country most of you couldn't find on a map, because he understood that service means putting others before yourself." When she finished speaking, the room remained quiet. Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, clearly moved by her words. "Thank you for sharing that, Sarah," he said gently. "I think that gives us all something important to think about." As the bell rang and students filed out of the classroom, Sarah gathered her books quickly, wanting to escape before anyone could make a comment about her outburst. But, as she reached the door, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Marcus Chen, who had been in the same government class. "That was really powerful," he said quietly. "My grandfather would have liked what you said. He always told me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of fear." Sarah managed a small smile. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was. He died last year, but I still wear his dog tags sometimes. Not where people can see them, but close to my heart. I understand why you wear your father's jacket." It was the longest conversation Sarah had with any of her classmates since starting at Lincoln High, and it carried her through the rest of what had been shaping up to be another miserable day. That evening, Sarah was surprised to find her mother home early again, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a serious expression on her face. "We need to talk, Nija," Elena said, gesturing for Sarah to sit down. Sarah's stomach dropped. Had someone from school called? Had her mother finally learned about the bullying? "I got a phone call today," Elena continued. "From someone at Fort Bragg. A Colonel Mitchell. He said he knew your father." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had heard her father mention Colonel Mitchell a few times, usually in the context of joint operations or training exercises. "He wanted to know if we would be open to having some people from his unit visit your school. Apparently, they're working on a new program to help students understand military service better. He specifically mentioned you, said that Miguel had talked about you a lot during their deployment together." "He remembered me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Apparently, your father showed him pictures and talked about you constantly. The colonel said Miguel was incredibly proud of you, that he bragged about your grades and your determination to everyone who would listen." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. Even in his final deployment, her father had been thinking about her, sharing stories about her with his fellow soldiers. "What kind of visit?" Sarah asked. "He wasn't specific, but He mentioned something about bringing some equipment and personnel to give students a better understanding of what modern military service looks like. He asked if you would be interested in helping coordinate it. Sarah's mind raced. The idea of having actual military personnel at Lincoln High was both exciting and terrifying. On one hand, it would be an opportunity to honor her father's memory and maybe help her classmates understand what military service really meant. On the other hand, it would put an even bigger spotlight on her, potentially making the bullying worse. "I don't know, Mom," Sarah said finally. "People at school already think I'm weird for wearing Dad's jacket. If they find out I'm involved in bringing the military to school, it might make things worse." Elena reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Mija, I know things have been hard for you at school. I know kids can be cruel, especially when they don't understand something. But your father would want you to be proud of his service, to help others understand what he died for. What if they just make fun of it? What if they turn it into another joke about the weird military girl? Then, they'll be showing their ignorance to people who actually understand what service and sacrifice mean," Elena replied firmly. "Colonel Mitchell served with your father. He knows what kind of man Miguel was, what kind of daughter he raised. He wouldn't be doing this if he didn't think you could handle it." That night, Sarah lay in bed wearing her father's jacket, thinking about the phone call and what it might mean. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos of her father in uniform, remembering the pride in his eyes when he talked about his service. Miguel Martinez had never backed down from a challenge, never let fear stop him from doing what he believed was right. Maybe it was time for his daughter to show the same courage. The next morning, Sarah walked into Lincoln High with a new sense of purpose. She still received the same stares and whispers, but somehow they seemed less important now. During lunch, instead of sitting alone with her military pen pal letters, she approached Marcus Chen at his usual table in the corner of the cafeteria. "Can I sit here?" she asked. Marcus looked surprised but nodded, moving his books to make room for her. "Of course. I wanted to thank you for what you said yesterday after government class. It meant a lot." "You don't need to thank me for being decent," Marcus replied. "Though apparently, that's not as common as it should be around here." Sarah laughed, a sound that felt foreign after months of silence. "I have something to tell you, but I need you to keep it quiet for now." Marcus nodded, leaning forward with interest. "My mom got a call yesterday from a colonel who served with my father. He wants to bring some military personnel to our school, to help students understand what military service really involves. He asked if I wanted to help coordinate it." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's incredible. Are you going to do it?" "I think so. I'm scared that people will just make fun of it, but maybe it's time they learn that military service is about more than just the stereotypes they see in movies." "When would this happen?" "I don't know yet. I'm supposed to call Colonel Mitchell tonight to discuss the details. But, Marcus, I might need help. I don't really have any friends here, and if I'm going to make this work, I can't do it alone." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "My grandfather always said that honor is something you carry with you, not something you can lose because of what other people think. I'd be honored to help you honor your father's memory." For the first time since her father's death, Sarah felt like she wasn't carrying her burden alone. She had an ally, someone who understood that some things were bigger than high school social politics. That evening, Sarah made the phone call that would set everything in motion. Colonel Mitchell's voice was warm and familiar, even though she had never spoken to him before. He told her stories about her father, about his dedication to his fellow soldiers and his unwavering commitment to the mission, no matter how difficult or dangerous. "Your father talked about you constantly," Colonel Mitchell said. "He was so proud of your academic achievements, your volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital, your maturity and resilience. He said you were the strongest person he knew, that you could handle anything life threw at you." "I don't feel very strong most of the time," Sarah admitted. "Strength isn't about feeling confident, Sarah. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're scared, even when it's hard. Your father understood that, and I think you do too." They talked for over an hour, planning what would become the most significant event in Lincoln High School's history. Colonel Mitchell explained that he wanted to bring a full military demonstration to the school, including personnel from multiple branches of service, equipment displays, and educational presentations. But, more than that, he wanted to create a moment that would honor not just Miguel Martinez's memory, but the service of all military families. "We're going to do something special, Sarah," Colonel Mitchell said before they hung up. "Something your father would be proud of. Something that will help your classmates understand what real courage looks like." As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in months. Tomorrow, she would begin planning something that would change everything. She would stop being just the weird girl in the military jacket and start being the daughter of Sergeant First Class Miguel Martinez, a man who had given his life for his country and whose sacrifice deserved to be honored, not mocked. For the first time since her father's death, Sarah fell asleep without tears, wrapped in his jacket and dreaming of the day when everyone at Lincoln High School would understand what it truly meant to serve. The next 3 weeks transformed Sarah's world in ways she hadn't thought possible. What started as secret planning sessions with Marcus during lunch had evolved into a full-scale coordinated effort involving school administration, local media, and military personnel from 3 different bases. Principal Watson had initially been skeptical when Sarah and Marcus approached him with Colonel Mitchell's proposal, but a single phone call from the colonel had changed everything. "I've never seen anything like this," Principal Watson had told Sarah after his conversation with Colonel Mitchell. "He's mobilizing resources that I didn't even know existed. This isn't just a school visit, Sarah. This is going to be something extraordinary." Word had begun to spread through Lincoln High that something significant was being planned for the Friday before Thanksgiving break, but the details remained closely guarded. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being the center of attention for positive reasons. Teachers who had barely acknowledged her existence before were now stopping her in the hallways to ask about the upcoming event. Even some of her classmates who had never spoken to her were suddenly curious about what was happening. "I heard you're bringing tanks to school," said David Kim, a junior who had never shown any interest in military matters before. "Is that true?" Sarah smiled mysteriously. "You'll have to wait and see." The truth was even more impressive than the rumors. Colonel Mitchell had coordinated with the Army National Guard, the Air Force Reserve, and the Navy Recruiting Command to create a comprehensive military demonstration unlike anything that had ever been attempted at a civilian high school. The plan included static displays of military vehicles and equipment, demonstrations of military technology, presentations about different career paths within the armed forces, and a special ceremony honoring fallen soldiers and their families. But the centerpiece of the event would be something that Sarah didn't even know about yet, a surprise that Colonel Mitchell and his team had been planning specifically to honor her father's memory and to show Sarah's classmates exactly what kind of man they had been mocking through their treatment of his daughter. Sarah's relationship with her classmates had begun to shift as news of the military visit spread. Some students remained hostile, particularly Jessica Palmer and her group, who saw Sarah's sudden importance as a threat to their social dominance. But others were genuinely curious about what was happening, and a few even approached Sarah with stories about their own family members who had served in the military. "My uncle was in Iraq," said Melissa Santos, a girl who had never spoken to Sarah before but had overheard her talking with Marcus about the upcoming event. "He came back really different. He doesn't talk about what happened over there, but my mom says he has nightmares sometimes. I never really understood what that meant until I heard you talking about your dad." These conversations were painful but also healing for Sarah. She was learning that she wasn't the only student at Lincoln High who had been touched by military service, even if others weren't as visible about it as she was. Her father's jacket had made her a target, but it had also made her a magnet for others who understood loss and sacrifice in ways that most teenagers couldn't comprehend. Marcus had proven to be an invaluable ally and had become Sarah's closest friend. His quiet intelligence and organizational skills had been crucial in coordinating the complex logistics of the military visit. He had created detailed schedules, contacted local media outlets, and even designed promotional materials that would be distributed to other schools in the district. More importantly, he had provided Sarah with emotional support during the increasingly intense weeks of planning. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked one afternoon as they sat in the library, reviewing the final timeline for the event. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if people still don't get it? What if I mess this up and dishonor my father's memory?" "Sarah, you could never dishonor your father's memory. The fact that you're doing this, the courage you've shown in setting this up despite everything you've been through, that honors his memory more than any ceremony ever could." The week before the event, Sarah received another phone call from Colonel Mitchell that would add an emotional dimension to the day that she hadn't expected. "Sarah, I have something to tell you about the ceremony we're planning," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah sit up straighter. I've been in contact with some of the soldiers who served directly with your father during his final deployment. 3 of them are going to be coming to your school as part of the demonstration team. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They knew my father? They served in his unit. Private First Class Johnson, Specialist Williams, and Sergeant Thompson. They were with him during some of his most difficult missions. They wanted to be there when we honor his memory, and they wanted to meet the daughter he talked about so often. The thought of meeting soldiers who had known her father during his final months was both thrilling and heartbreaking. These were people who had shared experiences with Miguel Martinez that Sarah could never fully understand, who had seen him in his final role as a protector and leader. There's something else, Colonel Mitchell continued. We've been working with the school district to make this event bigger than just Lincoln High. Students from the 3 other high schools in your district will be bussing in to attend the demonstration. You're going to have an audience of over 2,000 students and faculty. Sarah felt dizzy. What had started as a small educational visit had grown into something massive, something that would be seen by thousands of people. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity to educate an entire generation about the reality of military service. The night before the event, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat at her bedroom window, looking out at the clear autumn sky and thinking about her father. Somewhere among those stars, she imagined, Miguel Martinez was watching over her, proud of what she had accomplished. The scared, isolated girl who had been mocked for wearing his jacket had grown into a young woman who was about to honor his memory in front of thousands of people. Elena knocked softly on her door around midnight. Can't sleep either? I keep thinking about Dad, Sarah said as her mother sat on the edge of the bed. About what he would think of tomorrow. He would be so proud of you, Nija. Not just for organizing this event, but for the strength you've shown through everything. You've become the strong, compassionate woman he always knew you would be. They sat together in comfortable silence, both women wrapped in their memories of Miguel Martinez and their hopes for the day ahead. The morning of the event dawned crisp and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor military demonstration. Sarah arrived at school 2 hours early to help with the final preparations, wearing her father's jacket over a dress that Elena had helped her choose, something formal enough to show respect for the occasion but practical enough to allow her to move around and coordinate activities throughout the day. The transformation of Lincoln High School was stunning. The football field had been converted into a military display area, with vehicles and equipment arranged in precise formations that spoke to the discipline and attention to detail that characterized military operations. Army trucks, Navy recruiting displays, Air Force technology demonstrations, and National Guard equipment created an impressive tableau that could be seen from across the campus. But it was the arrival of the personnel that truly took Sarah's breath away. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines began arriving in the pre-dawn hours, setting up demonstrations and preparing for what would be the largest military outreach event in the state's history. These weren't just recruiters or public affairs specialists, these were active duty service members who had volunteered their time to honor Miguel Martinez's memory and to educate the next generation about military service. Colonel Mitchell arrived with the sunrise, immediately seeking out Sarah to check on her emotional state and to brief her on the day's events. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, noting the mixture of excitement and nervousness in her expression. "I think so. It's bigger than I ever imagined it would be. Your father was part of something bigger than he could have imagined too. Today, you're carrying on that tradition." As students began arriving for the school day, their reactions to the military display were everything Sarah had hoped for. The usual morning chaos of teenagers rushing to lockers and complaining about homework was replaced by odd silence as they took in the impressive array of military equipment and personnel. Even Jessica Palmer seemed stunned into silence by the magnitude of what Sarah had helped organize. The formal program began at 9 o'clock, with students from all 4 district high schools filling the football stadium. Principal Watson introduced Sarah to the assembled crowd, and she